The moment your heart stops beating, a cascade of biological processes begins that most people never think about. And what happens in those first 24 hours underground is far more complex and unsettling than you might imagine. This isn't about religion or folklore. This is about the actual physical reality of what occurs when a human body is placed 6 feet under the earth. The truth is simultaneously fascinating and deeply disturbing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why ancient cultures developed such elaborate burial rituals and why modern funeral practices exist the way they do. Let's start with what happens in the hours immediately after burial, because this is where most misconceptions begin. When a casket is lowered into the ground and covered with soil, the environment inside that coffin changes dramatically and rapidly. The temperature, the oxygen levels, the humidity, everything shifts in ways that trigger specific biological responses in the deceased body. Within the first few hours, the body's temperature begins to equalize with the surrounding earth. And this temperature change is actually one of the first major catalysts for what comes next. The human body, even in death, is still teeming with life, just not the kind of life you'd expect. We carry trillions of bacteria in our digestive system, on our skin, in our respiratory tract. And these microorganisms don't die when we do. In fact, they suddenly find themselves in a very different situation. During life, our immune system keeps these bacteria in check, confined to certain areas, prevented from spreading where they shouldn't go. But the moment the heart stops pumping blood and the immune system shuts down, these bacteria begin to migrate. They move through tissues that were previously off limits, spreading throughout the body in a process that begins within hours of death. This bacterial activity is the primary driver of what happens during that first night in the grave. The bacteria that once helped you digest food are now digesting you, breaking down cellular structures from the inside out. They produce gases as byproducts of this decomposition. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, cadaverine, putrescine, chemicals with names that hint at their unpleasant nature. These gases begin to accumulate in the body cavity. And because the casket is a relatively sealed environment, especially modern caskets designed to be airtight and watertight, these gases have nowhere to go. The pressure builds slowly but steadily throughout that first night. Now, here's something that catches most people off guard. The body doesn't just lie still during this process. The accumulation of gases causes the body to swell, sometimes significantly. The abdomen distends, the face becomes puffy, and in some cases, the buildup of pressure can cause fluids to be expelled from the mouth and nose, a phenomenon that terrified people in centuries past who didn't understand the science behind it. This is one reason why historical accounts sometimes mention sounds or movements coming from graves, leading to fears of premature burial or supernatural occurrences. The reality is purely biological, but no less unsettling when you consider what's actually happening 6 feet underground in the darkness. The timeline of these changes is remarkably consistent, though it can be affected by several factors. Temperature is crucial. Decomposition happens faster in warmer conditions and slower in cold. This is why bodies buried in winter or in northern climates decompose much more slowly than those buried in summer or in tropical regions. The type of soil matters too. Clay soil, which is dense and doesn't drain well, creates a very different environment than sandy soil, which allows for better air circulation and drainage. The presence of embalming fluids also dramatically alters the timeline, as these chemicals are specifically designed to slow down bacterial activity and preserve tissue. Speaking of embalming, this is where modern funeral practices have significantly changed what happens during that first night in the grave. In the United States and many other countries, embalming has become standard practice. Though it's not legally required in most places, It's primarily a cosmetic procedure to allow for open casket viewings and to delay decomposition during the period between death and burial. Embalming involves replacing the blood with chemical preservatives, typically formaldehyde-based solutions, which kill bacteria and cross-link proteins in the tissues, making them resistant to breakdown. An embalmed body buried in a modern sealed casket will experience dramatically slower changes during that first night compared to an unembalmed body in a simple wooden coffin. But even with embalming, the process cannot be stopped entirely. It can only be delayed. Eventually, the bacteria will adapt, the chemicals will break down, and decomposition will proceed, just on a much longer timeline. In the immediate hours after burial, however, an embalmed body might show almost no signs of change, remaining in a state of preserved suspension for days or even weeks, depending on the quality of the embalming and the conditions of the burial environment. For an unembalmed body, though, that first night is when the most dramatic changes begin. Within 4 to 6 hours after burial, something called rigor mortis reaches its peak. This is the stiffening of the muscles that occurs when the body's ATP, the energy currency of cells, is depleted, and calcium floods into muscle cells, causing them to contract and lock. The body becomes rigid, sometimes in awkward positions if the limbs weren't arranged carefully before burial. This rigidity will persist through most of that first night, only beginning to release after about 24 to 36 hours when the muscle proteins start to break down. At the same time, another process called livor mortis is completing. This is the pooling of blood in the lowest parts of the body due to gravity. Because the heart is no longer pumping, blood settles, creating dark purple-red discolorations on the back and sides if the body is lying face up, or on the front if face down. By the time of burial, livor mortis is typically already fixed, meaning the blood has clotted and won't move even if the body is repositioned. These discolorations remain visible through the early stages of decomposition. A stark reminder that the circulatory system that once brought life to every cell is now just following the laws of physics. The chemical changes happening at the cellular level during this first night are equally profound. Without oxygen being delivered by the blood, cells switch to anaerobic metabolism, a far less efficient way of producing energy that quickly exhausts itself. As cells die, their membranes break down, releasing enzymes that were normally contained within specific compartments. These enzymes begin to digest the cell from the inside in a process called autolysis, self-digestion. This is different from the bacterial decomposition happening simultaneously, but both processes work together to break down the body's tissues. The organs of the body don't all decompose at the same rate, and this becomes evident even within that first 24-hour period. The digestive system, being full of bacteria and enzymes designed to break down food, begins to decompose from the inside out very quickly. The stomach and intestines are often the first organs to show significant breakdown. The pancreas, which produces powerful digestive enzymes, essentially begins to digest itself. Meanwhile, organs like the heart and kidneys, which have less bacterial presence and different tissue composition, remain more intact during this initial phase. One of the most misunderstood aspects of what happens in the grave is the role of insects and other organisms. In a buried casket, especially a sealed one, insects typically don't play a significant role in the first night or even the first weeks. The soil provides a barrier, and modern caskets are designed to keep them out. However, in historical burials with simple wooden coffins or shrouds, insects would begin to arrive remarkably quickly, within hours if the burial was shallow. Flies have an extraordinary ability to detect the chemical signatures of death and can find buried remains with disturbing efficiency. But in contemporary burials at standard depths with modern caskets, that first night is primarily about internal processes, bacteria, enzymes, and chemistry. The casket itself plays a crucial role in determining what happens during those first hours underground. High-end metal caskets with rubber gaskets are marketed as protective or sealer caskets, designed to keep out water, air, and soil. These create what's essentially a sealed environment, which dramatically changes the decomposition process. Without air exchange, decomposition follows a different path. Anaerobic bacteria dominate, gases build up more intensely, and the timeline extends considerably. In contrast, a simple wooden coffin allows for some air and moisture exchange, creating conditions where decomposition proceeds more quickly, but also more naturally, with aerobic processes playing a larger role. There's also the psychological dimension of that first night that's worth considering. Even though we're talking about deceased individuals, human consciousness ends with brain death, which occurs within minutes of the heart stopping due to oxygen deprivation. There is no awareness, no perception, no experience of being buried. The fear many people have about burial, the claustrophobia, the darkness, the confinement, these are fears that only apply to the living. By the time burial occurs, usually days after death in modern practice, the person is entirely beyond any capacity for awareness. This is an important point because historical fears of premature burial, while based on occasional tragic realities before modern medical confirmation of death, have left a lasting psychological imprint on how we think about burial. The moisture content in the casket and surrounding soil is another critical factor in what happens during that first night. Bodies are approximately 60% water, and as cellular breakdown occurs, this water is released into the casket environment. In a sealed casket, this creates a humid, enclosed atmosphere that bacteria thrive in. The clothing the deceased is buried in becomes saturated, and condensation can form on the inside of the casket lid. If the water table is high, or if the gravesite has drainage issues, water from the surrounding soil can also begin to seep into the casket, especially in wooden coffins or in cases where the vault surrounding the casket isn't perfectly sealed. This external moisture can significantly accelerate certain types of decomposition, or, in some cases, create conditions for a process called saponification, though this typically takes much longer than one night to develop. Let's talk about the sensory reality of what that environment is like, because it's radically different from anything we experience in life. The absolute darkness is complete. No light penetrates 6 feet of soil and the casket walls. The temperature is cool and constant, insulated by the earth above, typically somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit in most climates, though this varies with season and location. The silence is total, punctuated only by the settling of soil above and the subtle sounds of the casket adjusting to the weight bearing down on it. There are no odors perceptible to anyone, as the gases being produced are contained within the sealed casket. It's an environment utterly cut off from the world of the living, and this isolation is both the point and the tragedy of burial. We remove the deceased from our daily lives while attempting to preserve them with dignity. The clothing and personal items buried with the deceased also undergo changes during that first night, though these changes are subtle and slow. Natural fabrics like cotton and wool will eventually decompose along with the body, but during the first 24 hours they're largely unchanged, except for becoming saturated with the moisture being released from the body. Synthetic fabrics like polyester are far more resistant to breakdown and can persist for decades or even centuries. Metal items, jewelry, belt buckles, casket hardware begin a very slow process of oxidation and corrosion, though this too is imperceptible during the first night. In essence, the non-biological materials in the grave have their own timeline of decay that's measured in years or decades rather than hours or days. One question that often comes up is what happens to the microbiome, the community of beneficial bacteria that lived in and on the body during life. During that first night in the grave, these bacteria are actually the primary agents of decomposition. The bacteria from your gut, which helped you digest food and produce vitamins during life, are now breaking down your tissues. It's a strange and somewhat poetic reality that we carry within us the very organisms that will eventually recycle our bodies back into the ecosystem. These bacteria produce the gases, the odor, and the chemical changes that define early decomposition. They're incredibly efficient at their work, having evolved over millions of years to break down organic matter. The soil composition around the grave also influences what happens even on that first night. Acidic soils can accelerate the breakdown of bone over the long term, while alkaline soils can preserve it. Soils rich in organic matter have more microbial activity, which can eventually affect the casket and its contents. Though again, this is a process that takes much longer than one night. Clay soils, being dense and water-retaining, can create anaerobic conditions that lead to different decomposition pathways. Sandy soils drain quickly and allow for better air circulation, which supports aerobic decomposition. The cemetery groundskeepers and burial professionals are well aware of these factors and often adjust burial practices accordingly, though most people arranging funerals never think about these geological considerations. There's also the structural reality of what's happening to the casket and vault during that first night. The weight of the soil above, typically around 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of earth for a standard 6-foot deep grave, exerts constant pressure on the burial container. Modern caskets are designed to withstand this pressure with reinforced construction and protective vaults that add an extra layer of structural support. But even high-quality caskets will eventually succumb to this pressure over years or decades. During the first night, you might hear settling sounds as the casket and vault adjust to their burden, as the soil compacts and finds its equilibrium. These are the sounds that, in earlier eras, might have contributed to ghost stories about restless spirits, when the reality is simply physics and geology at work. The question of what consciousness or identity means in the context of that first night is philosophically profound. The person who had thoughts and feelings and relationships, is gone. What remains is biological matter, following chemical and physical laws. Different cultures and religions have different understandings of what this means. Some believe the soul has departed, others that some essence remains, still others that death is simply the end of existence. But from a purely scientific standpoint, the first night in the grave is about transformation of matter, not the persistence of consciousness. The atoms that made up that person will eventually return to the ecosystem, becoming part of soil, plants, other organisms in a cycle that's been repeating for billions of years. Modern embalming practices have created a strange relationship with this natural process. We've developed technology to slow down decomposition, to preserve the appearance of the deceased for as long as possible. Even though we know intellectually that this preservation is temporary, an embalmed body in a high-quality, sealed casket might show relatively little change during that first night, or even during the first months, but eventually the same processes will occur. They're just delayed. This raises interesting questions about what we're trying to achieve with these preservation efforts. Are we trying to protect the deceased, or are we trying to protect ourselves from the reality of death and decomposition? The answer is probably both, mixed with cultural traditions and the oft commercial interests of the funeral industry. The first night in the grave is also when the separation between the deceased and the living becomes truly final. The funeral is over. The mourners have left the cemetery, and the earth has been replaced over the grave. For the living, this marks the beginning of grief's next phase. the reality that their loved one is truly gone. For the deceased, it's the beginning of their return to the earth, a process that will take years or decades to complete, but starts in earnest during those first hours underground. There's something both sad and comforting about this transition. Sad because it represents the irrevocable end of a life. Comforting because it connects us to the natural cycles that have always governed life on this planet. Understanding what actually happens during that first night in the grave can change how we think about death and burial. It strips away the supernatural fears and replaces them with biological reality. It helps us understand why different burial practices exist, why embalming developed, why sealed caskets are used, why burial vaults became standard in many places. These practices aren't just about respecting the dead, they're about controlling and managing the natural processes of decomposition in ways that align with our cultural values and our desire to protect the living from some of the harsher realities of death. The truth is that the first night in the grave is not so different from the second night, or the third, or the 100th. It's part of a continuous process of transformation that begins at the moment of death and continues until the body has completely returned to its constituent elements. What makes the first night feel significant is psychological. It's when the finality of burial is most fresh, when the contrast between the living person and the buried remains is most stark. But from nature's perspective, it's just one small step in a process that's neither dramatic nor unusual, just constant and inevitable. The biological processes we've discussed, bacterial activity, gas production, rigor mortis, cellular breakdown, these are the same processes that return all organic matter to the ecosystem. They're happening right now to fallen leaves in a forest, to a dead bird on the roadside, to the food scraps in a compost pile. Death and decomposition are essential parts of the cycle of life, making nutrients available for new growth, ensuring that matter and energy continue to flow through ecosystems. In this context, what happens during the first night in a grave is not morbid or grotesque. It's a natural and necessary part of the system that makes life on Earth possible. This brings us back to why we bury our dead the way we do. Throughout human history, cultures have developed elaborate burial rituals, not primarily because of what happens to the body, but because of what death means to the living. We bury people with care, with ceremony, with attempts at preservation, because it helps us process grief and show respect for the person who was. The modern funeral industry, with all its technology and products, exists at the intersection of this emotional need and the biological reality of what happens after death. Understanding the science doesn't diminish the emotional or spiritual significance of burial. If anything, it can deepen our appreciation for the rituals we've created to help us cope with loss. What happens during the first night in the grave ultimately reminds us of our own mortality and our connection to the natural world. We like to think of ourselves as separate from nature, as somehow above or beyond the biological processes that govern other organisms. But in death, these illusions fall away, and we see ourselves clearly as what we are: complex arrangements of matter and energy that exist temporarily before returning to the earth. This isn't a depressing realization for many people. It's actually comforting to understand that death is not an aberration or a punishment, but simply the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The next time you attend a funeral or walk through a cemetery, you might think about what we've discussed here. The invisible processes happening beneath the ground, the bacteria and chemistry and physics at work, the transformation of human remains back into Earth. It won't make the loss any easier, but it might give you a different perspective on what death means and why we handle it the way we do. The first night in the grave is the beginning of a journey that every human being will eventually take. A return to the elements from which we came, mediated by the same biological processes that have been recycling life on this planet for eons. So what really happens during the first night in your grave? Bacteria multiply and migrate. Gases accumulate. Temperatures equalize. Rigor mortis reaches its peak and begins to fade. Cells break down and release their contents. Moisture redistributes, and the body begins its slow transformation back into Earth. It's not supernatural. It's not mysterious in any mystical sense, and it's not something to fear. It's simply biology following the same laws that govern all organic matter. The truth they don't tell you isn't because it's too horrible to share, but because in our death-denying culture we often prefer comforting euphemisms to biological reality. But understanding what actually happens can help us make peace with mortality, appreciate the preciousness of life, and approach death with a bit more wisdom and a bit less fear.